Thank you, everyone. So we have a little over 15 minutes for questions, and I would invite perhaps we start with the panel, which is anything that you all would like to engage in where I ask each other.
I guess I should start. Can you all hear me? Okay, there's no microphone to pass around. Might be a little awkward, especially as we get to the end. And I wonder, do we want to move around the camera so that it now looks at the panelists? Okay, so as I received these papers over the last couple of weeks, I was just overwhelmed by the depth and the beauty and the thoughtfulness. And a couple of people have said something like, my book is landmark or definitive. By reading these papers, I can see that that is so much not the case. Wow, there is so much more to say that is so interesting and so valuable. So just thank you, David, for accepting my invitation. Thank you to all the rest of you for being here. I specifically chose this panel to be diverse, to have very diverse viewpoints. And for those of you who have been here the entire time, you can see that that has been very successful.
I was going to point out, I just wanted to make something, point out that I have sympathy with looking at C.S. Lewis leaning east. And when you were talking about Zernoff and the school that Lewis participated in, I learned a lot of my Lewis material from James Paine, who studied with Zernoff in Oxford back in the day, and who met C.S. Lewis when he was a student. And he convinced me in just mentoring me in my graduate program that Lewis was kind of making a truck stop along the way toward the east, and he wanted to go to Byzantium. Really, it was like the other Inklings. Byzantium was the goal, and so I'm in sympathy with what you're saying. Just to
Yeah, so just in response to that, I think we want to be very careful when we talk about what Eastern and Orthodox theology is, that we don't just take the voices of today, which can be sometimes polarized. So when some Orthodox theologians or well-known figures say, oh, that's Western atonement theory or whatever, this is actually really not the case. You can see what would be called Western atonement theory with emphasis upon the wrath of God and paying and receiving penalty from God in Chrysostom. So we want to be really careful that we read the whole tradition and that we don't caricature. Right, and I mean, I was really delighted to see you mark a transition in Lewis. I'm not so sure. We talked about this, that prima scriptura is in conflict with the final view that he was toying with at the end. And I think the reason why he decided not to publish it is that he's always interested in Christianity, mere Christianity, and didn't want to get into an ecclesial conundrum there. I think he was never wanted to do that. That was against his nature. But as I said to you, I think that maybe he would have liked the term scripture in the center of the whole tradition. And so it still is authoritative. It still has something to say. He would never accept something that was against scripture, right? But that it takes away this idea of what's logically first and so on, and it allows for more of an interplay. So, yeah.
you have a voice. I'll jump in just briefly and say I do think Lewis does have a fairly robust conception of hermeneutics. So like in the preface for Paradise Lost, for example, he talks about the necessity for any reader to become as far as is possible when reading Homer and Achaean Chief, when reading, I think he says Spencer, you have to, become one of Spencer's time. Same with, I think he says Chaucer. So the basic idea is that he recognizes this, and then he talks about the limitations of this. That, well, of course, we're all
unable to really fully do this, but that's the effort. So I do think he has sort of a robust idea of that. But I do think actually the fundamental difference that that I see, and I'm curious actually to hear your response because you know Bultmann. I agree with Leslie. You know Bultmann probably better than anyone alive right now, but and certainly better than I do. I'm curious to see how you would see the comparison here. That I think where Lewis sees his distinction, uh, and what I think he finds so distasteful, and it may be a bit of a misreading on his part. I don't know. Um, is that he and uh, I think Michael, you mentioned the difference between standing over and coming underneath. I think Lewis understanding like coming as a literary critic, he sees the role of hermeneutics or the method of hermeneutics as coming underneath the text and submitting to the text so that your mind is reshaped by the text so that the text kind of makes you a person of its world in a fashion so that you cease to be a modern person when you read that text if you read it right. Whereas I think Bultmann thinks that that's sort of ridiculous. That like, well, we can't stop being modern people, and we can't believe those things anymore because we know better on certain things than they did. And so Bultmann tries to translate. It's sort of the difference between formal and dynamic equivalence debates. They're sort of on different poles of that very hermeneutical discussion in some sense, and that's kind of how I see the distinction between them. I'd like to hear more from you on this because I think I can learn a lot from where you're.
I would like to say something quickly before turning over the microphone to David. Yes, in some ways, Lewis really did want to get under the text. So, for instance, at the end of his chapter on Scripture in Reflections on the Psalms, Lewis admits that we can't understand everything in the Bible. It's quite puzzling. And therefore, he believes that God did this on purpose so that we would not rely on the words of the Bible, but instead be conformed into the image of Christ. But when Lewis disagrees with the Bible, he is more than willing to stand in judgment upon it. So, for example, in Psalm 137:9, the Babylonian babies, he calls this devilish. And in fact, Elizabeth Anscombe wrote a review of Lewis's reflections on the Psalms, and she said that she wrote the review specifically because she did not want Catholics to read reflections on the Psalms because it might make them stand in judgment over the Bible, which is exactly what Lewis did. So it all depended on his purposes.
And by the way, that section of her book that's really good. By the way, your section there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that discussion in there is really fun to read.
I mean, well, I agree. You're right, Jason. I mean, I think, yeah, Lewis certainly has some sense of the hermeneutical, probably maybe to be more fair to him, I suppose. But I do think it's interesting if you compare. I think there's an interesting parallel here between Barth's and Bultmann's debate about hermeneutics regarding Romans in the 1920s here with Lewis. One of the things that Bultmann presses Barth about, Barth in his prefaces to his epistle to the Romans talks about how when you read Romans, the goal is to you enter into the mind of Paul himself, and you're there with Paul. There's a collapse of time between past and present. It's all in the eternal now of Revelation, so that there is no gap between past and present. And Bultmann then chides Barth for this, so, and right, and that for the same reason that you just brought up, that this is an impossibility. And in fact, actually, we need that distance to be honest interpreters of this text. That's part of that strangeness between the text and us. We have to respect that and acknowledge that and work within that. I think that something similar is the case with Lewis here. I do think that insofar as hermeneutics is any kind of interpretation, then sure, Lewis has the hermeneutical. But if hermeneutics in Bultmann's sense is a recognition of this otherness, this difference between text and me, between past author, present interpreter, that I do find Lewis to be less sensitive to or less acknowledging of. He wants to say that there is this grand timeless continuity of human existence, and we stand in some sense in the same position as Homer or Paul or anyone else. And as long as we're good readers of the text, by good, we empathetically engage with the text itself, then where we are in history and culture should be irrelevant. Yeah.
I think I pretty much fully agree. And I'll add one other thing. I think if I were going to summarize Lewis' sort of at least ideological approach on this, like what he aspires to on this, or holds up as ideal, is a kenotic way of reading, like where you actually become empty of what you are. It's in reading I become 1,000 men, and then never more so. Like he has a mystical notion of what reading is, right? And so this is Lewis the mystic in some sense. He believes that by reading you actually can do this. And I think that's the fundamental.
Does it for you.
Right, you're right. And I think there's also kind of a spiritual sense to this where he thinks you're getting assistance from God in doing this if you submit. And I think that's kind of the fundamental difference in some sense. I think Bultmann's just more skeptical about this. Yeah.
I wonder, David, whether I could push you to move away from timeless and think of another word like timeful in the light of what we're talking about. Because in an experiment on criticism, he acknowledges that there are people who will do with myth what he's not doing. He's very aware that there'll be anthropological and historical, and that's fine. But he says, my concern, and I don't think it's quite the same as charugma or principle or whatever. He says, my concern for the myth is the shape of it, the way that he's doing reader response, actually, the way that it makes its impact upon me, and something that acts as a myth for me might not for someone else, right? But it's not a matter of the time. It's a matter of, as was pointed out, being able to be drawn into the story and let it make its impact upon you. So I think timeful is a better way of looking at it, because he recognizes that there are differences. When he does Till We Have Faces, he shows the difference between the rock that's worshipped and the newfangled goddess, right? Who's beautifully decked out, and one has more power than the other. So anyway, I just a little suggestion there.
Please, Aubrey. I can ask her a question.
Well, I'm hesitant to put it in the because I'm thinking of it in this conversation between Otto and Bultmann, which has been so influential. And so what's going through my mind is our definition of history, because Otto is a history of religion scholar. And what was so notable to me in discovering this book was Lewis's seeming resistance to the particular myths that his moment was resistant to. And we'll find in lots of fun quotes, I've got books of quotes about the apocalyptic texts, that one of the major issues, they'll say things like, the apocalyptic texts are mediated through Judaism that had been sullied by East. I was thinking of Eastern, I was like, let's keep going East. And so one of my questions, and the timeful is interesting, is what myths? And I see Bultmann and Lewis enamored by different myths. It struck me actually in rereading The Worlds last night, in light of Bultmann, knowing that a Bultmann scholar would be on the panel. I read it even more carefully. It struck me how much agreement Lewis had in one of his images in that book, in that essay with Bultmann, which was, he says, he just believes that, this is actually going to happen. He's like, there's this, and he says, Christianity believes, the world is going to, there's an end, halt, and we have to respond correctly to that. And I'm like, that is precisely Bultmann. But then he moves away from that. It looks like he's going to start talking about that. And he ends up saying, well, he doesn't say he's doing this, but then he just does it. He's identifies that as not the issue, that we have a counter mythology, which is this scientism, this progressivism. And so I do wonder if it's the attraction to alternative mythologies that he would say. It's not really, because Bultmann does identify which particular, and presents a different myth, a rhetorical moment that he kind of imagines in a way. And this is just me thinking about, Bultmann. He does create a situation where he invites you to stand in front of Jesus at that moment between yourself and the eschatological event and respond correctly. Is that correct? Okay. So it was really interesting to me to see how Bultmann had determined that conversation.
So I love what you're doing. And I wanted to know whether you would consider, or whether you are, looking at sort of not recent, but the 70s and the 80s, you know, the apocalypse group here talked about not just looking at the temporal line, but also considering the spatial mystery into that. And in my work, I added to that the mystery of identity. So, you know, you point to the ending where there's this talk between Tor and the Eldil about what's going to happen, but it's followed by the grand dance. It's followed by our being let into things that we don't usually see in heaven and yes, so that those, yeah, and that I think it seems to me that that is Lewis's answer to the fixation on a cataclysmic ending that could kind of deform Christianity, and that people would reject, to say there's more in this world than you can see.
And this is where, to kind of go along with the theme that Lewis is sometimes better in certain kinds of writings than others. Lewis makes rhetorical moves that we buy too much. One of them is he'll say, "I'm not a scholar." And Leslie, in your book, you're always saying that. He's like, "I'm not a real scholar." And I'm like, I know what you're doing. Yes, like you're just getting people to like you, that right, to trust you.
Shucks move.
That's right. That's right. He does that, and then also he does the just the facts move, but he often moves away from that. Then he's like, just the facts. I'm thinking of the discarded image in particular, where he's like, here's the medieval picture of the world, and he's like enchanting you with it, and he's like, it's not, he's like, I don't actually think this is a correct world picture, but then he's like, but that doesn't matter. And I've been interpreting this with the apocalyptic literature in the same way, because I think people read that and they're like, we don't think like you could take an elevator up and hang out with Enoch, you know, right? That's silly. But I think he sees something essential, and this is Otto. There's something essential. There's an encounter with the numinous that happens when we look at those mythical world pictures, that we're accessing a reality that isn't an elevator to Enoch, but is something else. So I think there's a reality to that.
Good thing. Lewis may not think that you can take an elevator to Enoch, but he does perhaps think that you can take a bus to George MacDonald.
Yes, that's true.
And we Irish are fae, and I keep saying to my husband, you know, you're going to see a fairy sometime, and I don't think Lewis would have been at all surprised if a fawn arrived at his front door. I really, really think that's the case.
Well, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we must come to an end. For those interested in further sessions at our section on Orthodox interpretation sponsoring, we have another one at 1 o'clock on John 18 and 19, another one at 4 p.m. on the Psalms and Orthodox liturgy. But please join me in thanking our panelists for today.
I really am looking forward to it.